Yeah, so it's a great pleasure to have Ben Broadbent here. I've known Ben for, I've sort of worked it out, getting on for 20 years now.
20 years, yeah.
So yeah, it's very good. And I think, with Ben, you get great value because you're getting somebody who is, has the intellectual rigor of an academic, but also, knows policy and actually sort of spends his time looking at data and all that stuff that sort of city economists have to do. So he's sort of covered all angles. But I guess the key thing about Ben, which is for tonight, is he's also a very entertaining company. So hopefully he's going to give us a great talk on forecasting, which I think is the curse of economics and meteorology. But anyway, carry on.
Absolutely right. Thank you very much, Francis. Yes, I've called this talk Forecast Errors. It's turned out a little longer than I thought it would. That's the first error. But my plan is to sort of get to the end by 22, quarter to, and then we can have some questions. Now, there's a well-known joke about economic forecasting, which I came across when I first entered the world of work. Albert Einstein reaches the pearly gates of heaven and meets three people. He asks them all for their IQ. 190, says the first confidently. Oh, good, says the great man. We can talk about general relativity. When the second says 140, Einstein tells him he's looking forward to debates about the pros and cons of the nuclear deterrent. The third, peering at his feet and mumbling slightly, says, mine's only 50. What will the budget deficit be next year? Now, I feel I'm allowed to tell this joke because my first job at the Treasury was in a team responsible for forecasting the budget deficit. And if the joke is meant as a comment on the accuracy of such forecasts, or rather the lack of it, my early experience does not, regrettably, provide much of a defense. The first budget forecast I went through was in 1989, and that year's Red Book predicted that 3 years later, the government would be running a small financial surplus, as it had done for a couple of years previously. What we actually got, as things turned out, was the largest, or at least the then largest, peacetime deficit on record. So you can see that forecast error here, that green line. And of course one wonders what Einstein, whose theories generate predictions that even at relative speeds of 100,000 miles an hour differ from Newton's by 1 part in 10 million, would have made of this. Certainly, the economic commentators at the time were unimpressed. And it's not been of much comfort that we've since done worse, as you can see, if the failure to foresee a relatively contained and short-lived recession in the early 1990s did little to enhance the reputation of economic forecasting. The failure to anticipate the global financial crisis of 2008, which, as you can see, led to an even bigger error in the forecast for government borrowing, has diminished it still further. Famously, even the Queen saw fit to put the profession on the spot, asking economists why no one had seen the crisis coming. Now, laws and forecasts are different things, and it's unfair, I think, to compare them directly. It's true that economics doesn't have empirical theories as precise as those in the natural sciences, and nor can economists test their ideas as accurately. But even physical laws cannot provide us with wholly accurate forecasts, whether about the position of an individual subatomic particle a moment from now, or next week's weather. It was Niels Bohr, famous physicist and one of the fathers of quantum theory, who said prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So however much we dislike them, forecast errors are inevitable. Indeed, without forecast errors, we wouldn't even need forecasts. The world would be entirely predictable. Why would we bother? A world without forecasting errors wouldn't have the need for any financial assets either, or none at least whose prices ever changed. Nor would we ever experience financial crises. In fact, one answer to the royal question, why didn't we see the crisis coming, is that had it been easy to do so, we wouldn't have had a crisis, as people would have taken steps to avoid it. We only get to observe the crises that people didn't foresee. Now, this is hardly a complete or very satisfying answer. The events of 2008 may not have been easily predictable, but if it's true that being aware of the risk of a financial crisis means people take steps to limit its costs, then surely our duty to look for advance warning signals is all the greater. And the fact that forecasting errors are inevitable does not mean, clearly, that all forecasts are equally good or that none is beyond improvement. In his review of the MPC's forecasting capability published last autumn, David Stockton, who was formerly a director of research at the Fed, said, and I quote, "The MPC's recent forecasting performance has been noticeably worse than prior to the crisis and marginally worse than that of outside forecasters. Its errors have been characterized by persistent overprediction of economic growth and underprediction of inflation." And you can see that here. Of course, the biggest miss, these are 1 year ahead only, forecast errors. So this is the outturn for GDP growth less the mean of the MPC's year-ahead distribution for GDP growth. Big miss, obviously, in 2008-9. Growth in 2010 was actually stronger than the MPC, and many others thought it would be. But since then, persistently over-forecasting growth and equally under-forecasting for almost all the time inflation. And in addition, while he found the bank's explanation of these findings to be persuasive in broad terms, quote, Stockton also said, "Its narrative may not fully explain the persistence of these recent errors, which could reflect some inertia imparted by the forecast process, or problems with the paradigm underlying the bank's forecasts." And there's also been criticism of the forecast, as we know, most of it a good deal more trenchant than Stockton's, from domestic commentators. Now, the bank has already given a detailed, and I have to say very positive, response to the Stockton review, and I don't intend to add to that here, and nor will I attempt to analyse the MPC's forecasts in great detail or offer a blow-by-blow explanation for the recent record. What I do want to do, however, in the light of this criticism, is to reiterate that the mere existence of errors, and I think even the word is something of a misnomer, is not in and of itself evidence that something is wrong or even improvable. Suppose you divide these errors by their source into 3 types. Known unknowns, you might think of this as the sort of Rumsfeld classification, true forecasting mistakes, and unknown unknowns. So in the first bucket belong things like changes in the supply of oil or fluctuations in agricultural harvests or political surprises. These things cannot be predicted in advance, but they're all events with which we're familiar. They crop up regularly in our data sets, and we can therefore make reasonable attempts both to model their effects and to allow for the risk that they may occur in future. These known unknowns are what give rise to the MPC's fan charts. Now, the second category might include all sorts of things: the forecasting mistakes, a failure to choose the best possible model, excluding some relevant variable, or any number of other hazards. The important point is that to qualify as a genuine mistake, it should be reasonably identifiable at the time the forecast is being made. So failings that appear only with the benefit of hindsight belong in one of the other 2 categories. The third category, these unknown unknowns, are, as Rumsfeld himself pointed out, the most problematic. In the past, it's been populated, this category, by black swans, round as opposed to flat earths, a whole host of things that weren't even countenanced beforehand. And more prosaically, it includes what economic modelers call structural breaks, shifts in things that in our models we were previously treating as unchangeable constants. Now, it's impossible to make this classification completely cleanly. One person's economic shock or surprise may be another's forecast failure. So a forecaster who commits genuine mistakes may well be tempted to blame the resulting error on something else, particularly if it involves technical matter that an uninformed outsider cannot observe or understand directly. And knowing this, the outsider would naturally tend to view with skepticism protestations that errors are unavoidable. But I nonetheless believe that there is probably too much scepticism. People are too inclined to put into the second bucket what properly belongs in one of the others. And after a short description of how noisy and unpredictable many economic theories, in this particular case GDP growth, really are, I'm going to make two broad points in this regard. The first is that at least under some circumstances, distinguishing between economic models and their forecasting performance can take a long, long time. The greater the degree of true randomness in the world, the rarer the event you're trying to model, and the stronger one's prior belief about the structure of the economy, the longer it will take to be confident that any given forecast process is flawed or better than another. And I'm going to use some simulations to try and get that point across to you. And yet, and this is the second point, we are all of us genetically underendowed with the patience it can require to make these distinctions. We are instead, as the psychologist and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Daniel Kahneman, puts it, machines for rushing to judgment. And it's biased judgment at that. We are naturally, not irretrievably, but naturally too inclined to see structure in what is actually random, and we're also too inclined to view a forecast error, quotes, as precisely that, somebody's mistake. So let me talk a little about GDP growth. This is one of the things, as I say, the MPC's got wrong and seems to have got it repeatedly wrong in the same direction. And in a recent report criticising this performance, and before really getting the gloves off, as he subsequently did, one domestic commentator made the concession that, quotes, we cannot expect forecasts to be 100% accurate. Quite so. In fact, for most economists, and in most cases, we'd be pretty happy if we got even close to halfway there. So we have about 15 years now in which we have a consistent set of macroeconomic forecasters from a good number, about 20 separate organisations. And over that period, the standard deviation of GDP growth has been about 2 percentage points. So around 2/3 of the time, in 10 of those years, growth has been within that margin of the sample average, and the remaining 5 years it's been outside it. And the forecasts we have, all of them contain some information in the sense that they're actually correlated with year-ahead growth, which is at least something. At least they're not totally meaningless. But they don't contain that much. So of that 2 percentage point standard deviation, only about a third of it, between 30 and 40% of it, so about 0.6 to 0.8 percentage points, has on average been anticipated by any of the forecasts. So they've been able to capture something, but significantly less than half the movements. So even when we look only 1 year ahead, and obviously it gets worse and worse as you look further out, the unpredicted component in annual GDP growth, the pure noise, if you like, has been significantly greater than the signal we've been able to extract from the various economic indicators, and on average, close to twice as big. Now, these forecasts only go back to the 1990s, since when there have been, we know, huge shifts in the world economy and a massive financial crisis. So perhaps we're being unfair, perhaps we're judging them over a period in which the economy has been unusually volatile, an accurate prediction unusually difficult. But the economy has always been volatile. This is actually measured over 30-year rolling periods. It's centered on the lower axis. So the last data point will be the standard deviation of growth between 1981 and 2011, as it were. And it goes back through time in the same manner. And you've rarely fallen below that 2 percentage point number, actually. And obviously, particularly if you include the wars, the standard deviation of growth was far higher for much of the last century, and higher going back into the 19th century as well. So it certainly doesn't look more volatile over the last few years than it has been in the past. And although we don't have formal published forecasts for earlier periods before the late 90s, at least not as many as we do now, you can, if you want, we've done this, run a series of rolling regressions which include as a proxy for such forecasts, all the sorts of things that we're told, after the event at least, have been very important for growth. So I ran a whole sequence of rolling regressions with the past history of growth, equity, changes in equity prices, oil prices, government spending, government borrowing, short-term interest rates, long-term interest rates, the exchange rate, every possible thing in an entirely non-structural setting. And that does no better either since 98 or indeed rolling all these regressions. They're all out of sample forecasts. We've got data going back to 1900 for all those things. It doesn't do any better than the professional forecasts in the last 15 years. You still get, as I say, somewhere between 0.3 and 0.4, about 30 and 40% of the average movements in GDP explained by these forecasts. So on the face of it, it seems hard to generate year-ahead forecasts of economic growth in the UK that explain even one half the variation, let alone quotes the 100% accurate benchmark cited by this critic I told you about earlier. Now, some of you may look at this and just think, well, they're all rubbish. They're all bad and they should all do better. And of course, one hopes that as we learn more and as estimation techniques and economic theory get refined, we can indeed reduce the size of these errors, particularly the most extreme misses. But I think we have to accept as well that to a significant extent, many objects of interest to us, including GDP growth, are genuinely unpredictable, comprising at least as much noise as signal. And that in turn means that unless you have many, many years of data to work with, you have to be careful about assessing and comparing forecasts. The greater the noise in a series, the more often a bad forecast will outperform a good one, just through luck. And the harder it is to tell them apart. And I'm going to try and get this across with a simple simulation. I've got some Greek on the next page, but it's actually incredibly simple before you freak out. There's a simple, what economists call a linear model. There's something I want to know, but I'm going to forecast, which I'm going to call y. And there's something else I can see at least appear in advance. It's variable, this x thing. It might think of it as maybe some policy thing, which is sort of randomly assigned. I can see it appear in advance. And then there's some unpredictable component, which we might call the noise. So we can see x one period in advance. We want to forecast y. But there's this pesky last term, this epsilon term, which we can't see and is genuinely unpredictable. And then in addition, we're going to disagree about this beta term. We don't know, we cannot decide exactly to what extent the x affects the y. We can see x, but we don't know exactly what marginal effect it'll have on y. So imagine, for example, that I know the true beta and you lot have got it all wrong. You've got some other number, which I'm going to call beta 1. And I'm allowed to have it that way around because I'm the one giving the speech. If you were here, you could have it another way around. And the first thing to say about this is that with any significant noise in the system, if epsilon is at all big, if its movements are at all big, you, even with the wrong model, will sometimes make smaller prediction errors than me. Because it will just so happen that this little epsilon thing goes in the right direction to offset your error. And in fact, if there's enough noise in the system, your model can be wrong by a wide margin and still, quite frequently, outperform my perfect, i.e. sort of unimprovable forecast. So I've got this chart here where I've tried to get this across. And each line in this graph plots the likelihood for a given sort of ratio of signal to noise marked alongside these lines, that the wrong model, your wrong model, does better than mine. And along the x-axis is a measure of sort of how wrong it is. It's the ratio of the beta you're using to the true one. So when it's 1, you've got the right model, and I have. We've both got the right model here. But as you go further out along here, you get wronger and wronger. And you are pretty wrong here. And you might say here, for example, you're 100% wrong. Right? You've got twice the number that you should have. And here you're 200% wrong, and so on. You get wronger and wronger and wronger as you go out here. And this plots the likelihood that despite that, in any given draw, in any given prediction, you're actually going to do better than me, that your forecast error will nonetheless be smaller than mine. So obviously here, when we've got the same model, the chance is half-half. But even when the signal-to-noise ratio is 1, and remember in the case of GDP growth it looked closer to 1/2, it looked to be much more noise than signal, even if it were 1, and you were way out here, you were, again, 100% wrong in your understanding of the world, you'd nonetheless do better than me about a third of the time. Now, 1 year out of 3, you'd win. And rather annoyingly for me, knowing that I was right, the newspapers would all write, oh, he's an idiot and they're brilliant. That would happen 1 year out of 3. If you go to the red line, which as I was saying is a closer description of the way GDP actually looks and the extent to which it's forecastable, that would happen over 40% of the time, even more annoying for me. Now, of course, all these numbers are still less than a half, right? Because you're just getting wronger and wronger. You're never better because I've got the right model. And eventually, you with a bad model would get found out. But the key word is eventually. So the closer the performance of these two models, as it would be, the noisier the underlying data, the more important that epsilon term relative to the true signal, the larger the sample you need to distinguish these two forecasts. Otherwise, the gap in their performance, such as it is, gets dominated by sampling error. So what looks like superiority is more likely just luck. And you can see the importance of sample size in these two charts. Right? So here I'm imagining that in this world there is someone doing proper statistical tests saying which one is actually better. And they're looking year after year, they're judging the forecasts. And you've got your wrong model. In this case, I'm going to suppose, again, you've got twice the value for beta you have. So imagine the x variable is, I don't know, fiscal policy, and I know what the true multiplier is. You've got twice the right number. And I want to ask, how many observations do I need to see before I'm going to be reasonably confident that I'm going to be able to say with the normal thresholds we have, in this case 95% probability, that you have got the wrong model and I've got the right model. And the problem, remember, is this, that quite often you will do better than me. So the more noisy the series, the more noisy the underlying process, the less predictable it is, the more data I need to tell one forecast from another. So in that blue case, that signal-to-noise ratio is 1. I don't need that much. I think after about 10 observations, 10 years, say, if it was GDP of year-ahead forecast, I'd be half the chances are half that I'd have enough data to say, well, you've got the wrong model, definitively, I've got the right one. But I'd need 10 years. If the data were much noisier, I'd need 30 years of data. Anything less, I'm unlikely to be able to have enough data. The sampling error would be too big, anything less than 30, probably, for me to be able to say that you've got the wrong model, or I've got a better model than you. I'm unlikely to be able to do it. And of course, if in fact your model is less than 100% wrong, I'd need even more data, obviously. In fact, you can show that if your model is only 75% wrong, which is still probably pretty wrong, I probably need, 100 observations before I was able definitively to say, well, actually, I've got the right one and you've got the wrong one. That's a lot of observations. Now, I mentioned earlier that we have forecasts, separate forecasts from separate institutions for most main economic variables in the UK, going about 20 years now. Sorry, 15 years to 1997. We've got 20 different organisations. So those 20 different organisations, we can do these formal tests across all sorts of pairs. In fact, we can do 190 pairwise comparisons. So is forecaster 18 better than forecaster 11, whatever it is, 190 of them. And remember these numbers. Remember what I've shown. You need sample sizes of out here when GDP, this is more accurate description of how much noise there is in GDP. But in fact, we've only got this. And what do you find? Well, I can come up with decisive results out of those 190 tests for 10 of them. Now remember, these are tests that measure at 5%, at 95% significance. Right, so that says A test at 95% significance says that if the null were true, if these two models were actually identical, I would reject one of them in favour of the other 5% of the time only. That's what that standard means. Now, I've run 190 of these tests, and I find that 10 of them come up with rejections. That is, frankly, pure noise. There's nothing significant in it at all. And I would look at these tests and I'd say, I do not have enough data, 15 years worth, and I do not have enough to say that any of those 20 forecasters, frankly, is better than any other. We just haven't seen enough of how they've performed. Now, this is about a process that we see regularly. We get to see GDP, annual GDP data every year, and the forecasts of it. But this conclusion that you need a long time to say categorically that one thing is superior to another is only stronger, unsurprisingly, when you're trying to predict things that only happen very occasionally, say financial crises. So imagine now, and I've got another simulation for you, we're trying to predict not a continuous variable like GDP growth, but the occurrence or not of a discrete event that occurs randomly. And I'm going to assume for a moment that there's nothing to know about this event other than the average frequency with which it happens. So there are again two forecasters, and each of whom has his or her own estimate of this frequency. And it's possible this time that neither is right. Right, so we must decide which of them is better, and what we're interested in is how long this might take. And I've given some examples in this graph here. Well, this is the setup for you. So we've got something that happens occasionally. Percent chance per year it will happen. And I've imagined these three scenarios. So in one, the true event has a probability of 12% occurring every year. So the average frequency is every 8 or so years this thing happens. I don't know, a famine, say. And I've got two forecasters, if you like, two models, one of which says, well, I think the number's 8, and the other's 4. I've got two other scenarios like this. Now, you might have thought that these two are so far apart, these two models, and this one is so much closer to the truth than this one, that I should be able to tell pretty quickly which is better. But the problem is, these are all quite low. I don't get to see many events when the probability is like this. I don't get to see many financial crises. So it takes that much longer to decide which is better. Even though one is twice the other, for me to have half a chance of being able to say that the second model is worse than the first, it actually takes about 70 years. That's how many observations I need. Right, it takes a lifetime to decide that one is worse than the other, if all I get to see is whether or not the event occurs. Second model, I've actually said, well, suppose this guy's actually right, and the two numbers are both 8. And so he's got the truth. He knows what the truth is, and he's completely wrong. Then you would have thought, well, surely it takes a shorter time now. One of them's completely right. The problem is this number's come down, so we get to see even fewer events. So actually it takes even longer. In fact, it takes 200 years for us to have a better than evens chance of deciding that this one is worse than this. 200 years. Now, I've just put this in for fun. As it happens, I think, serious financial crises maybe once every 50 or 100 years is probably closer to the truth. If you were to just try and distinguish these two, well, it turns out it's about 1,100 years it would take. So basically, you never know, quite honestly. It's just indistinguishable. Those two things cannot be distinguished. Now, obviously, this is not meant as an accurate description of how models of financial crises work. That's not really what they're for anyway. We don't sit back and say, well, I think we'll have a financial crisis every 40 years, and I think we'll have it every 80 years. What we do is want to understand the risks and where they come from and what causes the risks to go up and down. But the point that learning about infrequent events and distinguishing between forecasts of those events takes time, that point remains. Whether it's the simple frequency with which they occur or a more sophisticated understanding of the risks that they do occur, we need a lot of data to to uncover these things with any degree of precision. And in the meantime, it probably won't be possible to make decisive comparisons between forecasts. It's simply not enough, even if it were true, to say, well, person A forecast the financial crisis and this one didn't. To know whether that is truly better or not, we need to know that that's not just a random thing. And it's that distinction that can take a long time. I've got one last forecast, one last simulation for you, then I want to get to these psychological points. Now, as Stockton points out, and as I showed you at the beginning, one of the features of the past few years, at least since 2010, is that our forecast errors have been persistent. We seem to have made them all in the same direction, and repeatedly to have over-forecast GDP growth. And he accepts that there are a few things, things that could not fairly be described as predictable, that can help to account for some of this. You know, inflation has been boosted by persistent rises in commodity prices. We couldn't reasonably have known that was going to happen. Growth has suffered from that and also from adverse developments in the euro area that were only very partially anticipated by anybody, certainly by financial markets. And as we've seen, we should be cautious about inferring too much from a relatively small sample anyway. These are the over-predictions we've had. We've basically over-predicted GDP growth 3 years in a row, more or less. And you know, even an unbiased model has a 1 in 4 chance of making errors in the same direction 3 times in a row. And that's a probability miles beyond the thresholds we normally view as statistically significant. But, you know, we've made downward revisions to more medium-term forecasts, as you can see here. And you know, this is the change in the MPC's mean forecasted growth between 2 years and 1 year ahead. So it's, in other words, it's what happened to our forecast for a particular date between when it was 2 years away and when it was 1 year away. And those two have generally been downwards. And so I think it's legitimate to ask whether or not there's something else going on than just luck. Problem is, it's not an easy question to answer, even if it's easy to ask. And the reason is that after a big shock, the sort of structural break I alluded to at the beginning, you may well need time to learn. And during that time, you are likely to make repeated errors in the same direction. Indeed, it's only by making these errors that you get to learn about the world in the first place. So I'll just refer briefly to another simulation to get this across. You can read more about it. What I'm imagining here, and I think there's some thread of realism to this, is a world where actually trend growth itself can change. Right? We've tended to assume for a long period of time it's just chugging along at whatever it is, 2% a year. I'm now going to imagine that actually what it does is switch. And it switches in an unpredictable way. For a while it can be 2. Say on average duration, those periods might last 6 years, and then it might switch suddenly. And economists use these models sometimes to describe the world. It switches down to 0. Now I'm going to imagine to begin with that that's 3 years. It happens to be the average length of a sort of down to, these are the average lengths of expansions and contractions and post-war data up until the financial crisis at least. So you switch here, and then there are also these random variations and shocks to growth within each state. So you can be in this higher growth state, and it might vary around. It won't be exactly 2 every period. And also in the low growth state, you'll have this variation. And what that means is that if a switch has suddenly taken place, you don't get to see that it has. All you get to see is growth. It's not immediately clear whether growth has fallen because of one of these temporary things. You're still in the high growth state, you're going to soon go back, or whether it's actually a switch, whether you've moved into this lower, more persistent world. You don't really know, immediately at least, and you can only know over time because you get the forecast persistently wrong. Even the best possible forecast from this world will take time to work out what has happened. You'll put weight on both possibilities. Suppose you suddenly switch into the low growth world. You think, okay, well, I'm not, that maybe we're still in the high growth world, I've just had one bad outcome. I'll put some weight on that possibility. But maybe we're stuck in something new, which I don't really know about, and we're going to, in that case, this low growth will persist and I'm going to put some weight on that. Now, if you have actually switched, you will over-forecast growth. And indeed, even if you change your weight slightly to adapt to that and to learn from it, you will continue to over-forecast growth until you realize that this switch has been made. And you can work out what these shocks look like, what the expected errors you're going to make will look like. And they all tend to be in the same direction. And I've actually tried to match the parameters in this model to what goes, the numbers that we have in the economy. Roughly speaking, I've tried to sort of imagine that we're suddenly in a financial crisis where the low growth world can persist for a while. This is the kind of errors you'd expect to make. After the event, they look biased. You think, well, this is stupid. Surely they shouldn't make mistakes repeatedly in the same direction. But to somebody, a contemporaneous observer at the time, they're not biased. It's just that he or she is having to learn about the world as they go along. And I think, that this captures something about what we've been going through. We had a huge shift in 2008-9. We've had productivity growth over the last 3-4 years that has been pretty much unprecedented in UK experience, and that's an experience that goes back a long, long, long time. We have a lot of data, and we're having to learn about it as we go along. I think in all fairness, it wasn't entirely predictable, it wasn't entirely knowable that this would happen. Now this, of course, is a simulation. Indeed, it's one I've chosen to get a point across. And you could very easily criticize lots about its realism. Not least, the fact that the observer in this model only gets to see growth itself. We were sitting there in 2009. We got to see lots of other things other than GDP. We knew, for example, that we'd had an enormous financial crisis, that much was clear, and we also knew, if we bothered to read Reinhard Rogoff, the trustworthy bits of it, that growth after financial crises, recoveries tend to be pretty slow. So you could say, fairly, that rather than having to wait and see this happen and slowly learn, you should have realized earlier that growth was going to be slow. You should have looked at the historical experience. And I think there may be something to this. Certainly in my case, because in my last job, I too over-predicted GDP growth in 2011 and 2012 by a margin. And although I can blame some of that on unpredictable events, I also have a sense that I failed to attach enough weight to the historical experience. And implicitly, I was assuming probably, I think, a more rapid cleansing of the balance sheets of the banks and a faster improvement in the general functioning of the financial system than had occurred after other financial crises when I didn't really have an obvious reason to assume that. That's at least is my best interpretation of where I went wrong, other than just luck. But the point I'm trying to make here, which I think still remains, is that we are, to some extent, having to learn about the economic implications of the crisis as we go along. And given that, it's almost inevitable that we're going to make serially correlated forecast errors. So all this, in a sense, just says something that maybe you think is entirely obvious, in pointing out that the world is unpredictable and that you may need a lot of data to distinguish true structure from what is just luck, what is just chance. Well, it may seem blindingly obvious, but as anyone knows who started reading the psychological literature and this wonderful Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, we often, all of us, seem to behave in ways that we do not intuitively grasp that point. If you toss a coin 4 times in a row, you're much more likely to get a sequence of uninterrupted heads or tails than if you do it 7 times. And yet someone drawing the smaller sample is just as likely to interpret those sequences as evidence as bias. Sports fans are too readily convinced that an individual player's sequence of successes, sequences which, given enough random variability in performance, are bound to occur from time to time, are evidence of good form that will persist into the future. The finance industry rewards people for predictive success when that's often just luck and unlikely to endure. And by the way, it also goes in the other direction. That if you ask people to generate random sequences. If you say, please write down what you think is a random sequence of heads and tails of a coin toss, and they don't actually have a coin to hand, they will write down far too few sequences of heads in a row or tails in a row. They'll have too much alteration. They'll write down something that isn't actually random, because they tend, they know, to over-interpret those sequences as patterns when they aren't really patterns at all. And in fact, I learned yesterday from somebody who told me this, that a couple of years ago, Apple had got so many complaints about its iPod, the shuffle function in its iPod. People had said, it's not really random, because I get my favourite song twice. You're watching me, you're spying on me. And so they deliberately had to go back and reprogram the shuffle function to put in more alterations than a truly random sequence would generate. It's not actually random any longer. So we continually try and see structure in the world where there isn't any. And it's not clear, to me at any rate, why evolution has made us like this. But the tendency to see the world as more deterministic than it really is has clear knock-on effects. It means, for example, that we systematically underestimate the likely error in our own judgments. So faced with general knowledge questionnaires, and I remember being given one of these a few years ago, that asked not just for quantitative answers, but the confidence bands around them, people repeatedly make those bands far too narrow. So the true answer lies outside those intervals far more often than people anticipate. And this overconfidence effect, which I say is pretty well documented, applies to so-called professionals as well as amateurs. So one of the first experiments to establish it was using psychiatrists themselves. And a related failure is called hindsight bias. I have to say, by the way, when you start reading this stuff, it gets pretty depressing. Human beings seem to be sort of, irrational, egocentric, ridden with biases and neuroses. And this bias, too, is both widespread and well-established. And it's the tendency, this hindsight bias, so-called, to see events that have already occurred as being more predictable than they really were. So people are prone, retrospectively, to exaggerate the probability they'd assign to events that did occur and to understate the likelihood that attached to things that did not. And the interesting thing is this is not just about appearances. So unless you actually remind somebody with hard evidence of what they did believe, they will seem genuinely to believe that their prior predictions were different from what they actually were. And Kahneman points out in his book that this can have, quotes, pernicious effects on the evaluations of decision makers. We are prone to blame them for good decisions that worked out badly and give them too little credit for successful moves that appear obvious only after the fact. All is not lost. I say it's sort of humbling and depressing to read about this, but we're not pure irrational instinct. We're also thinking and rational beings. And if we apply our reason properly, we can counter some of these weaknesses. For the same reason, economic forecasters, including the MPC, should continually expose themselves to question. This is one of the things that Stockton recommends, rightly. More outside examination, more people asking you whether the process is actually right, whether you're doing the right thing. And we should also keep in mind that over the past, we've only been able to predict a minority of movements in GDP, for example. We should guard against our own overconfidence. And clearly, the same obligation to remember that the world is truly random and that things that have happened weren't necessarily knowable in advance should apply to people who judge forecasts. Recently, I spoke to somebody who told me that ahead of the financial crisis, he had seen a model that predicted its occurrence with 100% certainty, quotes. Now, it struck me as pretty odd. It's not just that, apart from death and taxes, nothing can be predicted with 100% certainty. Nor is it simply that if there had been such a model, there probably wouldn't have been a crisis. What were all those people doing? Buying and financing assets if their demise, that is the asset's demise, had been as inevitable as an apple falling from a tree. What was striking to me is that after an event that one would have thought should make us less certain about the world, he had become more certain. His beliefs about the causes about the prior likelihood and about the consequences of the financial crisis were completely settled and definitive. And that meant he also viewed the failure to predict the event or the weak growth that has followed as genuine and avoidable mistakes. Now, to some degree that may be true. As I said, I think it's partially true in my case. I think it probably were things that I should have looked at if I'd worked harder or paid more attention that may have reduced my forecast error. And clearly, it would be unforgivably complacent for us not to learn from this experience. So to quote from Stockton again, he says, "The observation that forecasting errors were widespread during this period does not obviate serious introspection on the part of forecasters about what went wrong and what lessons might be learned." And that introspection could well lead one to the realization that there were avoidable mistakes. But at the same time, we should remember that it is only through forecast errors, i.e. by only coming across things we hadn't previously thought of, that we discover more about the world. David Hendry, distinguished econometrician, said we should be pleased with forecast failures as we learn greatly from them. Yet in reality, as I mentioned from all this psychological research, we do not find it a pleasing experience at all. All of us prefer to be right, and we're made uncomfortable by events that don't fit into a coherent model of the world, preferably the one we already hold in our heads. Psychologists tell us that these instincts are so deep-seated that they often override our rationality. We wishfully see structure in random events. Believing this structure, we're overconfident about our own predictions, and when it comes to others' predictions, we are too quick to assign significance to their forecasting errors, whether small or large. If the forecast turns out to have been accurate, we immediately assume the forecaster is good, rather than that it was just luck. Similarly, when it's wrong, we're quick to blame the forecaster rather than chance. We've seen with some of these simulations, it can take, with enough chance, an extremely long time to tell apart a good from a bad forecast. But our instincts often jump the gun. And I think these pitfalls are sometimes apparent in the coverage of economic forecasts, including the MPCs. In a speech in 1999, shortly after the MPC had been founded, the current governor, said it should be easier, in principle, for central banks than it is for governments to admit our ignorance about the future. He said, "Perhaps one of the strongest arguments for delegating decisions on interest rates to an independent central bank is that whereas democratically elected politicians do not often receive praise when they say, 'I don't know,' those words should be ever present on the tongues of central bankers." And of course, it was this that led to the idea, when the inflation report was first launched, that the growth projections are to have these spreads around, to have fan charts, not single numbers. And yet, it's still the case that when inflation report forecasts are being reported, they're almost always reported as precise point estimates. MPC says inflation to rise or growth to fall. When, in an inflation report press conference shortly after I joined the MPC at the end of 2011, the governor asked rhetorically, when someone said, "What's going to happen in the Eurozone?" I think he said, "Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in the next 12 months? And there seemed to be a sort of consternation, not to say alarm, that you shouldn't be able to comfort us with an exact prediction of what was going to happen. And although Stockton himself, when you read the report, never reached this conclusion, he merely said that subsequent events, quotes, "may not fully explain the size or persistence of the bank's forecasting errors." And in fact, he focused most of his attention not on the outcomes, but on the process of the forecast. Nearly all the coverage of the report in the press was about the errors and the failure that they represented. Now, I don't want to belabor these points. I should not leave you, certainly, with the impression that economic forecasting is so inaccurate that we shouldn't bother with it. For one thing, unfortunately, if you're doing monetary policy, you have to, because policy acts with a lag. Alan Greenspan said some years ago, implicit in any monetary policy action or inaction is an expectation of how the future will unfold, that is, a forecast. And in any case, the inflation report is very useful for things other than just the production of the fan charts. It gives us a framework for discussing alternative policies, and it allows the MPC to communicate with the public. Nor, obviously, should I be too defensive about the criticism. I've tried to make the point that you may need a lot of data before valid criticism of the performance of economic forecasts becomes possible. But we should always, obviously, be interested in how to improve them and alert to the possibility that they are genuinely flawed in some way. And even invalid criticisms have their uses. So psychologists have looked at this overconfidence effect and done it, obviously, ever since it was first discovered on all sorts of different groups. I don't know if you're pleased or not to hear that the British turn out to be one of the least overconfident. Is it a good thing or not? I don't know. They've done it on, this is two particular things. I don't want to suggest this as a general finding about these professions, but it's two particular surveys. I found it quite interesting. And it conveys this overconfidence effect in two separate surveys. One in predictions of precipitation by weather forecast, and the others in a diagnosis of, I think, pneumonia by doctors. Let me explain what these are. These are different sorts of predictions, some of which may be further out in time. So the further out they go, the accuracy of these forecasts falls for weather forecasts, for example. And I think there's more or less evidence or more time similarly involved in the doctors' ones. There are two axes. This is the true accuracy of their forecasts. They do them several times, and they can monitor whether they're actually accurate or not. They also asked these people in these surveys how accurate they thought their predictions would be. They asked them about these confidence intervals in particular. And that's reported down here. So if you're underconfident, you'll tend to find that what you report is bigger than what actually prevails. So you'll be up here. If you're overconfident, you'll be down here. I've got these the right way round, actually. Let me think. I think these axes are labelled the wrong way around. Take it from me. The result of this is that the doctors, and I'm not suggesting one should be either surprised or unsurprised by this, turn out to be a great deal more overconfident than the weather forecasters. They tend to believe that their diagnoses are much more accurate than they turn out to be, on average. The weather forecasters, on the other hand, are pretty realistic about what they believe and the reliability of their forecast. And the author of the book, the psychologist, Michael Scott Plous, from whom I took this chart, rightly or wrongly, suggests that maybe one of the reasons for this is that weather forecasters are continually being bashed over the head and told how rubbish they are. And it's only if you ram home that point that the natural overconfidence effect is overcome. So while it may wrongly presuppose the existence of some much better forecasting process out there, one that doesn't make errors, quotes, the criticism the MPC gets for its forecast should at least keep us honest about our limitations. And that's where I'll end, and I'm overdue. So we're going to run over with questions, but if anyone's got any, fire away.
Thank you first for what you've got. Sorry. Yeah, could stand next to each other. Okay, questions? Yeah, back there. Oh, I think you've got a microphone coming, so if you...
You mentioned several common biases, including optimism, overconfidence, hindsight bias.
Yeah, so I can't hear you very well.
Do you take any measures to reduce the biases rather than improving the forecasts themselves in your forecasters?
Well, certainly the MPC tries to look all the time about whether its quotes its fan charts are sufficiently wide or, I mean, that's the main way. We already have a forecast process which allows us to say something about what we believe to be the uncertainty around them. And that, I think, is a major step forward. As I say, it's not often something that's reported in that way, but I think it's a major step forward. And we can guard against it by checking over time. As I suggest, it will take a long time conclusively to say that the fan charts are either too wide or too narrow, but that would be the way to do it. And I have to say, the governor, when he goes to the press conferences, continually says to people, the probability that the modal forecast is correct is precisely zero. I mean, he's always trying to remind people that these are uncertain things. So I hope the answer is yes. But I can't tell you there's some sort of systematic thing where we say it. The best guard against it is having this fan chart and being able to measure how it does.
I've got a question over there.
You managed to explain, I think, really nothing. I think you explained why, in a way, forecasts are, I mean, the errors or misforecasting or non-forecasting is not only explicable but actually necessary. That was sort of novel to me. So what about the people who do predict things, who are maybe coming from a very odd institutional or extra-institutional setting, the people who warn, the whistleblowing types one reads about? And is it that, in a way, they're bad forecasters, meaning to say they are not going through the system and the iterations in the way that forecasters are? So we don't hear about the times when they fail, but it's pretty spectacular when they get it right.
No, of course.
And unless you believe in something ineffable like intuition, it must be that they're simply not constrained by the sort of institutional discursive framework.
No, I think there's an incentive in people, and I saw this in my last job, which involved some sort of forecasting. If you believe that you get, either people have short memories, or that you get rewarded more for getting something right than you do punished for getting something wrong, then it clearly gives people an incentive to go for outlandish forecasts. And I think that can happen. I'm asking a slightly different question, I think, but I think that people...
Not so much the outlandish, but it seems to be intuitive and ultimately correct.
When you say ultimately correct, well, part of this book that I found, all of it, I recommend it. It's interesting, and a lot of it's sort of documented already, but it brings it together in a very nice way. It says that one of the interesting things about, quotes, intuition is that whenever it's been, almost everywhere it's been tested, you can, what's called an algorithm, a simple methodological, unemotional forecast does better than a human. So one of the famous examples, and this I'd heard of before, an economist who was interested in wine, I called David Ashenfelter at Berkeley, I think. Was he at Berkeley? Somewhere on the West Coast. Decided he wanted to model how the prospects of a young wine turning into a good or bad wine 10 years later. And until he did this, it was still done through experts who taste the wine and sort of sit there and then say, well, it's going to be, it's thumbs up or thumbs down. And he didn't even taste the wine. He got a model which looked at, how much sun it had had, where it had grown, what the rainfall was in April and so on, and just shoved it through some box. And it did better than any of the experts. Now, the experts were furious, of course. But there may or may not be something called intuition. All I know is that when people systematically try and assess it, it doesn't do that well. And it's not to say that we've got the right black box either. Clearly we haven't had. What I've suggested here is it's difficult even to compare the black boxes. It takes time to compare any of these things. There's one over here, yeah. That's it.
I've sat through and I've been invigorated. I never thought I would be. I'm a headhunter. I hate to say my wife is a master of wine, so she'll probably comment.
Forgive me. What I just said was rubbish.
Could I just say, the one thing you haven't said, nobody predicted the subprime crisis. Arguably, President Clinton was responsible in 2002. You may have a view. What I'd like to ask you is, you haven't mentioned that great science, the law of unintended consequences. Could you comment on that and whether that is actually an integral part of what you do? Because there are a very few people in the world who are developing models taking this very, very seriously. Well, and this is not a hostile question.
No. I quite understand.
Take your time.
Of course, the law of unintended consequences doesn't tell you what will happen. It simply says that, I think it's very material, but it's germane, because it says it's really about the dangers of overconfidence, it seems to me. If you believe too strongly that you have the right, correct model of the world, you are more prone to making policy errors, it seems to me. You're more prone to doing something bold and more prone, therefore, to the law of unintended consequences. I think that's the only thing I'd say. But part of this also is, from with the benefit of hindsight, not judging too much. And sometimes it's very difficult to judge even with hindsight. So, we're struggling to understand why productivity growth in the economy is weak. That's hard enough after the event. I think to have forecasted it is doubly hard. And similarly, I hear a lot of accounts, not only of people who say they knew the financial crisis was coming, but are extremely clear about why it happened. And I think one has to be careful of that, because it's actually probably quite complicated, I think, why it happened, actually.
When we're back there.
Hi, I'm interested in your view about whether it's statistically too early to say or call this new economy sort of a new normal. Because I hear that term phrased a lot. I was interested about the statistical break.
Right. Well, there is clear statistical break. So if you draw a graph of output growth and employment growth, I'm thinking of one extreme example of this, and they go like this and they match together, smooth. And then you stop the clock here and you draw output growth, which has sort of done this and flatlined down to 0. Over the last 5 years, it's been more or less 0. And you look at the gap between what that would lead you to believe about employment, if you'd known only what's going to happen to output in the economy and what actually happened. That gap is, whatever, it's 4 standard deviations. It's about 1 in 500 chance that it would have occurred under the old relationship. That's a very different thing, again, from saying, well, it's going to persist and it's, quote, a new normal. I don't know, frankly. I mean, unfortunately, we have to make that judgment when we're setting monetary policy. But I can't say we can make it with any degree of confidence. You could tell a story where this is I've written about something which I think may be a part of it, but even if you think you've begun to understand why it's happened, I don't think that tells you how persistent it's going to be, quite honestly. And all we can do is look at all the evidence we can, including what's happened in past financial crises. We can try and understand why it's happened in order to tell us what we might be able to do to improve it, and edge towards an understanding. But just saying, quote, it's the new normal, establishes by default its persistence. It's not. So there is a clear structural break. Whether that persists for another 2 years or another 10 years, it's very hard to say, I think.
Should we take one last quick question?
Thank you. One of the conclusions you might draw from your talk is to be A, very cautious about individual forecasts, B, to take a range of forecasts from different forecasters, and C, look for a sequence over time to see how robust those forecasters are. I wonder, in the light of that, whether you think it was wise of the government to stuck a lot of its eggs in one basket of setting up the OBR and giving it such a responsibility for forecasting, given its, by definition, lack of track record.
Well, I think the first part, I think what you said is right, and indeed somewhat perversely, because of course we can all see each other at the same time. The consensus, the average of the forecast, does a lot better than many of the individuals, which is a bit odd. Why do the individuals bother? Including myself, actually. So that's true. On the other hand, I think for the OBR, I'll say what I said earlier about monetary policy, they have to have some view. They have to have some view. Now, an alternative would have been, and Robert Choate will say this to you quite happily, you could go away and just take the consensus forecast for growth. Unfortunately, that's insufficient, because to come up with a proper view of the behaviour of the government budget and tax receipts, you need to forecast a lot more than is available from the consensus. And I think that's probably why they made them forecast a lot of other things, because it's just not enough. In other words, the OBR, suppose it does worse than the consensus on GDP. The only thing I'd say and I don't know if that's true actually, we don't know yet, for all the reasons I explained. It's doing a lot of other things and getting a lot of other information that most forecasters, nearly all of them, just don't bother with. Now, that said, what you said earlier still prevails. If you're genuinely interested just in what's going to happen to the economy, look at more than one person. and approach it rather skeptically, and do not confuse professions of great confidence on the part of a forecaster with genuine accuracy.
Well, that's a good point note to finish on. Thanks very much for going to me.